Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Jonathan Allen. He's the Executive Vice President of Strategic Markets at Decision Lens. Jonathan, good to have you with us today.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be here.
And let's begin with strategic markets. Just tell us what that is for you.
So my job is to work with our executive team and the rest of the company to point us in the right direction. So we have a decision-making platform that helps a lot of different organizations with a lot of different use cases. What we're trying to do is figure out how we can be most useful and most beneficial. I'm sure we'll talk about that today too.
All right, and the area we're going to concentrate on is just wonderfully known as PPB&E, and that's not a type of sandwich, but a budgeting, processing, execution process for the entire DoD planning cycle. So tell us about what it is you try to do in that cycle. Give us the big picture of where you live in the PPB&E.
Sure. So briefly, and you know this, PPB stands for Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution. And really, an oversimplification of that is it describes the timeline of the planning processes within the government, particularly in Department of Defense. And so Decision Lens and we help organizations to understand and plan better during each of those processes. Planning further out than 5 years. Programming is what we know as the POM, is the 4 to 5 year time horizon. And then as you get into the budgeting and the execution, you're doing budget planning for this year and execution activities for your execution year of funding. Decision Lens helps with the planning of every aspect of that process.
Now, all federal agencies have different aspects to their budget planning, and it's really, at the least, it's a 2.5 year process. In DoD, you mentioned a 5 year for specifically the PPB&E. What are the specific challenges under PPB&E that are perhaps unique or more intense, say, for the Defense Department versus, say, agriculture?
So one of the challenges that Defense Department is dealing with is the acceleration of change that's taking place. And I think I think we see this with Ukraine and Russia, or other types of what we call emergent requirements that come in that require a change. And the PPB&E process is designed to create a lot of stability across the time horizons that we're dealing with. It's, as you know, it's a long-standing process, and that has a lot of benefits to it. But one of the challenges is it makes it difficult for it to be agile and adaptive enough when you have emergent requirements that come in. The other thing that I would say is around the data. So I'm gonna give you 3 Ds about the challenges with the data. The data itself actually is not necessarily the problem. We have a lot of data comes in, and our clients are able to manage that. But there are several things that happen with the data. One is that it can be disconnected across the PPB&E process. So by disconnected, I mean that the data used in the POM process is different than the data in the budget execution process. Another is it can be delayed. So imagine a situation where you bring your data in, you cull it together, and then you put it on PowerPoint slides, and there's this little as of date at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide when you're presenting. Well, if that's a week old, then the commander or the leader might say, okay, I understand what you're saying, but what happened in the last week for this? And then the last D I would say is disparate, meaning the data can be disparate, and I don't mean just disconnected. I mean by disparate, it is different in kind to other types of data. And so it goes to different functions having different types of data, all of which are important for planning purposes, but it creates a disconnect across those different areas. And that's where I think we see a lot of challenges.
Okay, and we're going to get into each one of these and how you deal with them, but I wanted to ask the idea of stability and adaptability. That's kind of ironic, given that it's the Defense Department, and this was all developed during the Cold War, which was hardly a stable, predictable time in world relations, and we're living through a difficult time now. So one of the results you see, and you tell me if this is a result in part of the issues with PPB&E, is that every year at least one of the major military branches, and sometimes all of them, end up going for this big reprogramming effort with Congress, which itself can take 6 months.
Right, that's true. And that does happen, and I think you're right in terms of the stability. Part of the thing that's happening here with, for example, let's take one aspect of the PPB&E, which is the POM planning process, Program Objective Memorandum. This is the kickstart of the planning process, and usually is a planning process over a 4 to 5 year horizon. What you're doing in the POM process is acquisition organizations are using this, as well as operational organizations. And so it's used to plan out major construction projects, as well as other more near-term, agile kinds of technology or other weapon systems kinds of things. And so because the POM is used across the board, it sometimes has challenges in knowing the best ways to, or people have challenges knowing the best ways to adapt in that POM process.
Got it. So in other words, it's sort of a single size for many different requirements.
I think so. And it's not that the POM process itself is wrong or inherently bad. It's that organizations often struggle in this day and age to be able to tie the POM activities to the budgeting and the execution activities when their actual appropriations are coming in and they're executing on their budget.
Yeah, because operational parts of the DoD have very different timelines within their own lives, as does, say, acquisition. And so sometimes that's a big mismatch.
That's right.
And they each have their own POM idea. So there's a POM for acquisition, for example, and a POM for a brigade that might have to plan whatever it needs for its mission as assigned by leadership.
That's right. And I would say that as you get into the, let's say the brigades or the field units or things like that, they might contribute into the POM process, but they're dealing more with the way that those appropriations come down and for them to fund at that level. And I'll just give you an interesting example. When we were talking with one FM leader, financial management leader in the DoD space, one of the things that he said is, the POM process sometimes becomes a theoretical exercise. It's almost wholly disconnected from what they're trying to do in a budget planning and execution standpoint. And part of the reason for that is when they're doing budget planning, a lot of times they'll take the operational requirements from the previous year as the input going into the actual budget execution, budget formulation process that they're dealing with. And so there's sometimes a disconnect between what's happening at the POM level and what's happening at the budget execution level.
Sure, because you can't predict when, say, one country will invade another, and therefore there needs to be some kind of NATO manifestation, for example.
Yeah.
I guess maybe somebody could have predicted it, but not exactly the fiscal year in which it would happen, or even within the... Okay, got it.
That's right.
All right, so how do agencies then in DoD begin to take on some of these problems? Let's talk about the, like say, the disconnectedness of data.
Yeah, so let me give you another example that I think might help to kind of think about not just the disconnectedness, but also the delay issue that I mentioned. We work with a major command in the Air Force who is using us, Decision Lens, for their POM planning process. So they've automated their POM planning process. But Tom, it's interesting. When I first sat down with them a couple of years ago, they were a little bit skeptical. They had a number of homegrown solutions. They had obviously spreadsheets and PowerPoint that they were using. And these are very, very smart people that do this. What I explained to them was an analogy that I'll give to you that I think is helpful. You remember back in the day when there were flip phones and then PDA, personal digital devices like Blackberries, and then we finally got to the smartphone. Well, I myself was skeptical when I had my BlackBerry because it could do email and it could do texting and calling. So I said, why would I need a smartphone to do that? What I didn't realize is that the smartphone allowed for me to have other apps that I could add onto my system, and it could do all kinds of other things for me. And what I explained to these leaders in the POM process was that in some areas of the government right now, they're still on flip phones, aka spreadsheets and PowerPoint. In other areas, they're on, maybe these PDAs or Blackberries where they're using a platform like a SharePoint or homegrown solutions to be able to cull that data and bring it together. But the smartphone version is, a collection of technologies that allow for them to do other things besides just organize and manage the data. And as we started to talk about and understand that, they saw that once they were able to organize and manage their data, they could then look out and do better decision making on the back end of that with new apps and new other kinds of functionality that would be beneficial.
Got it. So that makes the POM maybe potentially more projectable across that future state than it is when they're doing everything manually?
That's right. So as we go back to disconnected and delayed and disparate, basically what we can do today with technology is we can bring together data in a meaningful way onto a centralized, systemized platform that allows for multiple people to come together and see that transparently and then to start to make decisions around that in real-time fashion as opposed to over a delayed period of time.
And maybe describe in a little bit more detail what you mean by automation of the POM, because the POM is a narrative, it's a document in which people write things to justify the program. But so what are the automatable aspects of it? What are the other elements in there that you can bring automation to?
So you're right. The POM itself is a document. It's a deliverable that gets submitted. And on that deliverable, it has the projected funding and the allocation of resources for that period of time. But the POM process, as we call it, includes many, many different stakeholders that are involved in submitting requirements or submitting changes. For example, this major command in the Air Force that I was mentioning needed first to collect the data across many, many different Air Force wings and bring that data together where they're submitting changes to the POM going forward. Then they needed to prioritize those, and then they needed to figure out how do we allocate the resources of funding, from our previous POM to this year's, to the new POM cycle that we're going after. So that POM process is fairly complex. It requires a lot of stakeholders, and there are key decision points throughout that process where if you can focus on those decision points, it can give you an eye towards that line of sight to the overall strategy.
Okay, so in other words, that makes then the justification not only easier and faster, but also more accurate in terms of what you need to know to convince someone that, yeah, this program needs this, that, and the other at this point in time.
That's exactly right. And then in terms of your question on automation, what it does is it gives you the ability not only to have a defensible, justifiable strategy, but it gives you a living, breathing process that can adapt to emergent requirements as those are coming in. And that's the key, is a more agile approach, to being able to do this.
So it becomes almost a continuous process of POM. You could update even when it's not due, and therefore you're ready for the next time. And maybe it's something you review weekly or monthly or whatever, quarterly, instead of starting from scratch each time there's a new fiscal year coming around.
That's exactly right. And so when you can have that continuous process in place, it also translates into some of the other budget processes. So another process is the unfunded requirements process that happens more in your execution year of activities or your budget year. And that unfunded requirement process can also become a living, breathing system of requirements that you're using to make decisions about where to allocate your resources.
Yeah, just to continue with the Air Force, suppose a hangar is damaged suddenly, and these are not inexpensive repairs.
Correct.
But if it happens during the current budget year, then you've got a big unfunded requirement.
That's correct. So an unfunded requirement can be from something that happens, an external factor. It can be from an emerging requirement that you didn't know you were going to have, something new, because again, the theater of war changes or there's a change in the overall strategy. Mm-hmm. And so it can come from a lot of different places, but those unfunded requirements sometimes are, there's a lot of funding, let me just say that goes to these unfunded requirements. And what sometimes happens at different organizations is because they don't have that transparency into the process and understanding of that, they may fund what's just easiest to fund in the near term as opposed to what might be best for the organization.
All right, we're going to dig deeper, but right now we're going to take a short break here. My guest today is Jonathan Allen. He's the Executive Vice President of Strategic Markets at Decision Lens. I'm Tom Temin on the special Bulletin review, Modernizing Federal Government Planning, sponsored by Decision Lens here on Federal News Network.